The verdict did not arrive with anger or spectacle, but with a calm so absolute that it felt more terrifying than any declaration of war, spoken in the neutral, echoing chamber of the Galactic Council, where stars themselves were reduced to icons on floating displays, and the lives of entire species were weighed like entries in an accounting ledger. Where Supreme Arbiter Vel, ancient, elongated, his skin the pale gray of fossil stone, stood beneath the convergence of 1,000 observer orbs and announced, without emphasis or hesitation, that responsibility for the destruction of the Iridian archive had been formally assigned to the human colony designated New Horizon, a settlement barely 3 decades old and populated mostly by second- and third-generation colonists who had never known Earth except through stories, images, and the gravity-adapted bones of their parents. And behind the Arbiter, the chamber filled with a rotating projection of what had once been the Iridian Archive, a ring-world megastructure older than recorded galactic history, a construct built by a precursor civilization so ancient that even their name had been lost, a structure that housed not weapons or armies, but knowledge, stellar maps predating modern hyperspace, ecological blueprints of extinct biospheres, philosophical treatises encoded in light and gravity, knowledge that had survived supernovas, galactic realignments, and wars that had erased entire species, now shone as a broken halo of debris slowly spiraling into the gravity well of a dying star. And the Arbiter's voice continued, even and unyielding, explaining for the record that the archive had not been targeted, attacked, or exploited by humanity, but had been destroyed as a secondary consequence of a human-led emergency intervention in the Cury system, where a previously stable star had entered catastrophic collapse and threatened to sterilize 3 inhabited systems containing over 40 billion sentient lives across 6 species, and that human vessels, civilian, military, and industrial alike, had arrived first not because they were obligated, but because they were closest, and because, as the Arbiter stated with faint disdain, humans possess a documented tendency toward disproportionate response when confronted with extinction-level threats, and so they had acted, deploying experimental mass drivers and gravitational shear arrays to divert stellar matter, literally reaching into the heart of a star and pulling, saving worlds that were not their own, an act that the Council itself had commended only weeks earlier. Yet now, with the same detached tone, the Arbiter explained that the redirection of the star had produced a shockwave through subspace, a ripple that intersected the Iridian Archive's stabilizing field and caused a cascading failure, tearing apart a structure that had endured for millions of years in the span of seconds. And while the chamber filled with the low murmurs of representatives who understood the implications, the Arbiter raised one thin limb and silence fell again, because under Iridian restitution law, an ancient legal framework invoked only 7 times in recorded galactic history, balance had to be restored not through intention or moral context, but through equivalence of loss. And as the words were translated across thousands of languages and neural formats, the realization spread like frost through the minds of those listening that this was not going to end with reparations of energy credits, territory, or labor. And then the Arbiter said it plainly, cleanly, with no hesitation: "One human life shall be surrendered." And for the first time since the chamber had been constructed, the silence that followed was not procedural, but shocked, because this was not a death penalty for a criminal or a combatant, but an offering, a symbolic sacrifice demanded to balance the destruction of irreplaceable knowledge. And when the Arbiter continued, clarifying that the life in question would be non-combatant, non-decision-making, and of minimal strategic value in accordance with Iridian precedent, some representatives began to understand where this was going and attempted to object, only to be overruled by the cold machinery of law. And then the final clause was spoken, the one that would later be remembered as the moment the galaxy crossed a line it did not yet know existed.
The offering shall be a human child, age range 6 to 10 standard years. And across human space, across Earth, Mars, Luna, and the outer colonies, across habitats spinning in darkness and cities built beneath alien suns, screens lit up simultaneously as the ruling was transmitted, and parents stopped breathing, conversations died mid-sentence, and a species that had endured plagues, wars, and near extinction felt something entirely different settle into its collective chest, because this was not loss. This was violation, and on New Horizon itself, a modest colony carved into the regolith of a tidally locked world, the name was released as part of the ruling, not in malice, but in procedure. Lena Calder, 8 years old, born under an artificial sky, daughter of a systems engineer and a hydroponics specialist, a child whose medical file described her as healthy, whose psychological profile described her as curious, empathetic, and prone to naming stars that did not officially have names yet, a child who had nothing to do with stars collapsing or archives falling, a child who at that exact moment was watching a storm roll across the colony's shield dome and asking her mother whether the thunder could hear itself. And the Council granted humanity 72 standard hours to comply, not as a courtesy, but as a logistical window, because Iridian law required that the offering be surrendered willingly to maintain balance, and as the transmission ended, the Council moved on to the next agenda item, already categorizing the matter as a tragic but necessary correction. While on human worlds, something unprecedented began to form, not riots, not immediate retaliation, but a deep, gathering stillness, the kind that precedes tectonic movement, because for the first time since leaving Earth, humanity was not being asked to pay for a mistake with blood in war or labor in debt, but with the life of a child. And somewhere in the vast distance between stars, the galaxy had just learned the letter of the law, but not yet the cost of enforcing it.
The galaxy waited for humanity to react, because every precedent suggested they would, loudly and emotionally, with protests filling council chambers, fleets maneuvering for leverage, diplomats shouting about injustice and proportionality. And for the first few hours after the verdict, the analysts were already predicting compliance dressed in outrage, because that was how the galaxy understood lesser powers behaved when confronted with ancient law. But what followed instead unsettled even the most cynical observers, because humanity did not protest, did not argue, did not demand revisions or clarifications, and most disturbingly of all, did not speak at all. As hour after hour passed without a single official transmission from Earth, Mars, or any of the major human polities, no emergency sessions, no statements of refusal or acceptance, just silence stretching outward across human space like a vacuum. And at first, the Council interpreted this as shock, then as internal division, then finally as resignation, because silence in galactic politics usually meant submission, and the Council's economic models began recalibrating under the assumption that humanity would comply within the 72-hour window, perhaps attempting to extract symbolic concessions later. And so the chamber returned to routine, unaware that something far more dangerous than outrage had begun, because while no words were spoken, actions were already unfolding quietly and with terrifying precision, beginning with trade, as human merchant fleets, civilian vessels crewed by independent operators, family corporations, and union collectives simply failed to arrive at their destinations, not rerouted, not delayed by accident, but absent entirely, their transponder codes still active yet holding position in deep space or returning to human-controlled ports. And at first this caused only mild concern because trade delays were common and humans were known for chaotic logistics. But then medical shipments failed to arrive at frontier systems dependent on Terran pharmaceuticals because human biochemistry had solved problems other species still struggled with. And within hours, clinics reported shortages of regenerative compounds and immune stabilizers, and still no explanation came.
Then agricultural exports stopped. Protein cultures and engineered grains that fed entire orbital populations simply vanished from shipping manifests, and the systems most affected sent polite inquiries to Earth that went unanswered. And then, almost imperceptibly, hyperspace traffic reports began showing anomalies as ships exiting jump points encountered human vessels already present, not forming blockades in any recognized military sense, not broadcasting threats or demands, merely occupying space, massive hulls dark and inert, holding position at critical intersections of trade and transit, forcing reroutes that compounded delays into cascading shortages. And still the humans did not speak. And by the 24th hour, the silence had become a subject of alarm, because humanity was not acting like a species cornered by law, but like one executing a plan too large to announce. And internal human communications leaked to galactic intelligence agencies showed no panic, no riots, no internal blame, just a singular convergence of sentiment expressed in millions of variations of the same phrase, "Not the child." And on New Horizon itself, the Council's enforcement observers arrived expecting to begin procedural preparations, only to find the colony calm to the point of eeriness, streets orderly, systems functioning, and surrounding the residential sector where Lena Calder lived, a presence that had not been there the day before. Human soldiers, not in riot gear or parade formation, but in quiet readiness, veterans from different fleets and units, some retired, some active duty, some technically civilians now, standing watch not because they had been ordered to, but because they had volunteered. And when enforcement officials requested access to verify the subject's identity, the colony administrator denied them politely and cited emergency protective statutes, not threatening violence, not even raising his voice, simply stating that no child would be removed from human custody. And when the officials protested that this was non-compliance with council law, the administrator replied that they were welcome to file a complaint and closed the channel. And as the 48th hour approached, the council's confidence began to fracture because the economic impact was no longer theoretical. Entire sectors were stalling, orbital habitats dimmed lights to conserve power as fuel shipments failed to arrive, and insurance markets collapsed as human underwriters suspended coverage galaxy-wide, a move so unprecedented that several member species attempted emergency negotiations, still assuming humanity was posturing for concessions. But every attempt to establish dialogue met the same void, and analysts finally began to understand that this was not leverage-seeking behavior, because leverage required demands, and humanity had made none. And the truth emerged slowly and uncomfortably. Humans were not trying to change the ruling, they were preparing to refuse it entirely. And worse, they were doing so in a way that did not require a single shot fired, because by the 60th hour mark, human fleets were no longer just present at trade junctions, they were everywhere, spread across thousands of systems, not massed for war, but distributed with strategic elegance, occupying positions that only a species with centuries of logistical warfare experience would recognize as critical, positions that allowed them to say, without words, that nothing in the galaxy truly moved without human cooperation anymore. And still the silence held, and it was this silence that began to unsettle other species on a deeper level, because humanity had always been loud, argumentative, emotional, quick to explain itself, and now it was behaving like a force of nature, implacable and indifferent to expectation. And in the final hours before the deadline, as the council convened in emergency closed session, something unexpected happened, something no model had predicted. Unsolicited transmissions began arriving at Earth from non-human sources, not from governments, but from individuals, families, civilian collectives, messages short and halting, often poorly translated, expressing confusion, fear, and something like admiration, asking how humans could be so united, how a species fractured by internal conflict could draw such a clear line without debate. And the answer, though never officially broadcast, was simple and universal across human space, because this was not a political issue or a legal argument or even a matter of sovereignty. This was a reflex older than civilization, older than spaceflight, older than language itself, the instinct to protect offspring at any cost. And when the 71st hour arrived, the galaxy finally heard a human voice, not raised in anger, not trembling with grief, but steady, controlled, and unmistakably resolved, as a single transmission activated across all council channels and public frequencies, revealing a human woman standing alone against a neutral background, no flag, no military insignia, no display of power, just a simple emblem behind her depicting a small figure flanked by two larger ones, and she introduced herself calmly as Ambassador Mara Ellison of Earth, and said, "You have asked humanity to surrender one of its children," and paused long enough for every listener to feel the weight of that sentence, before continuing, "The answer is no." And in that moment, as the words propagated across the stars, the galaxy understood that the silence had never been uncertainty or fear, but deliberation of a far final kind, because humanity had not been deciding whether to comply, but how to refuse in a way that would make the refusal irreversible. And the deadline had not been a countdown to surrender, but a warning humanity had allowed the galaxy to exhaust. And as the transmission ended and the silence returned, it was no longer empty, but charged like the space between tectonic plates moments before they shift. And every species watching knew, with sudden and dawning clarity, that whatever happened next, the galaxy that emerged from it would not be the same one that had casually demanded a child.
The council chamber had never been designed for fear, only for debate, hierarchy, and the slow, grinding certainty of law. And yet fear seeped into it now all the same, as Ambassador Mara Ellison's image lingered in the air long after her transmission should have ended, her final words echoing, not because of volume, but because of their simplicity. And in the seconds that followed, no representative spoke, not because protocol demanded silence, but because none of them yet understood how to respond to a refusal that did not come wrapped in threats, negotiations, or pleas. And when the Supreme Arbiter Vel finally attempted to reassert procedural control by declaring humanity in preliminary non-compliance, his voice carried none of its former authority, because the chamber's observers were no longer looking at him. They were watching the data feeds flooding in from across known space, feeds that showed what humanity's silence had enabled. Because while the council had debated wording and precedent, humans had continued moving pieces across the galactic board with a precision that bordered on artistry. And as enforcement fleets began tentative maneuvers toward human space, they found routes closed not by weapons fire, but by absence. Jump gates unpowered, refueling depots shuttered, navigational beacons offline, not destroyed but deliberately disabled by their human operators, who had left behind notices citing temporary suspension of services. And when one particularly hawkish member species attempted to escort an enforcement vessel through an alternate corridor, the corridor collapsed behind them, not catastrophically, not violently, but cleanly, a controlled gravitational shear that rendered the route unusable for months, a feat that required a level of engineering coordination that only humans possessed in such abundance. And still no shots were fired, no declarations of war issued, only consequences unfolding in widening circles. And the council began to understand that enforcement, even if legally justified, was no longer logistically possible without cooperation from the very species they were attempting to coerce. And as panic began to ripple through closed channels, Mara Ellison's image returned, unannounced, the council's systems overridden not by hacking, but by access rights humans had quietly accumulated over decades of mutual cooperation. And when she spoke again, her tone had not changed, but the room had, because now every representative understood that they were no longer presiding over a hearing, but standing at the edge of a precedent that could shatter the authority of ancient law itself. And she said calmly, "You believe this is about justice,
and with a gesture brought up a comparative display, one side showing the Iridian archive as it once was, the other showing human casualty lists from wars, disasters, and evacuations, millions of names scrolling endlessly. And she continued, "You believe balance is achieved by equivalence of loss, but humans do not measure balance that way." And she explained, without accusation, that humanity had never been unified by law alone, because human law changed constantly, adapted, broke, and reformed, but there were principles beneath it older than any statute, principles that did not require consensus votes or enforcement fleets, principles that lived in reflex and instinct. And she said, "We are a species that survived because we learned one thing early. If we do not protect our young, nothing else matters." And the council attempted to interrupt, citing Iridian precedent, but she raised a single finger, not in dominance, but in finality, and the interruption died. And she laid out humanity's position with devastating clarity, explaining that the child was not negotiable, not because she was unique, but because she was not, because she represented every human child, and that surrendering even one would shatter a covenant humanity held with itself, one that said the strong exist to shield the weak, not trade them. And then she offered alternatives that stunned the chamber into stillness, offering herself as replacement, offering reparations so vast they bordered on absurdity, offering entire worlds if necessary. And then, finally, she outlined the consequence of refusal, not as a threat, but as an inevitability, explaining that humans would not target civilians, would not seek annihilation, but would withdraw expertise, logistics, and infrastructure support until the Council's authority eroded under its own weight. Because humanity could endure isolation, could survive scarcity, could adapt to collapse as it always had, but the galaxy as it existed now could not. And as she spoke, messages began appearing on auxiliary channels, not authorized by the Council, not censored, raw and personal, alien civilians broadcasting from frontier worlds, orbital habitats, and deep space stations, speaking in broken translations about children of their own, about laws that had demanded sacrifice before, about fear of councils that ruled from distant chambers. And one by one, these transmissions coalesced into something the Council had never faced: moral defection. Because while governments hesitated, people did not, and entire systems began declaring refusal to participate in enforcement actions. Dock workers refused to service Council vessels, navigators declined assignments, security forces stood down, not because they had been ordered to, but because humanity had articulated something that resonated across species lines: the idea that there must be a line law cannot cross. And as the 72nd hour arrived, the Council attempted one last procedural maneuver, declaring intent to proceed regardless of compliance. And in response, humanity did something unexpected again, something devastating in its restraint, as all human fleets powered down weapons systems simultaneously, broadcasting a simple status code indicating defensive posture only, a message that said, in effect, "We are not coming to fight you, we are simply not participating anymore." And that was when the true scale of the situation became undeniable. Because without human participation, enforcement fleets could not reach their targets, supply chains collapsed further, member states began withdrawing from Council authority to preserve internal stability, and the supreme arbiter Vel, ancient and unyielding, finally faltered, his voice cracking not from emotion, but from the realization that the law he embodied had never been tested against a species willing to walk away from the system entirely rather than violate its core principle. And as emergency votes were called and alliances fractured, one truth crystallized in the chamber: the Council could take a child and lose the galaxy, or retreat and preserve a version of order. And for the first time in its long history, the Galactic Council faced a choice it had never prepared for, because it had always assumed law would be obeyed, never imagining that a species would refuse not from rebellion, but from conviction so absolute it rendered enforcement meaningless. And as the votes began to shift and the ruling teetered on the brink, the galaxy held its breath, understanding at last that this was not about a child anymore, but about whether power came from fear and precedent or from the willingness to protect the smallest life, even when the cost was everything else.
The vote did not unfold like previous council decisions, with formal addresses and ritualized pauses designed to reinforce authority, but instead like a dam failing under pressure too long ignored. Because as representatives activated their panels one by one, the chamber filled not with confidence, but with fracture. Abstentions mounting, first as cautious species withdrew from responsibility, then open dissent as entire blocks rejected enforcement outright. And when the final tally appeared, it was not a victory so much as a retreat, the ruling suspended rather than overturned, the demand for a child withdrawn under emergency revision clauses that had not been invoked in 10,000 years. And for a long moment no one spoke, because the Galactic Council, which had defined itself as inevitable, had just proven itself negotiable. And Supreme Arbiter Vel, ancient beyond memory, stood motionless, as if carved from the same stone as the chamber itself, his authority intact on paper, yet irreparably diminished. And when Ambassador Mara Ellison returned to the Channel, she did not celebrate or posture or claim triumph, but acknowledged the revision with a simple nod, her voice steady as she said, "The child remains with her family." And across human space, the silence that had held for 3 days finally broke, not into cheers or songs, but into breath, a collective exhale so profound it bordered on grief. Because victory had never been the point, survival had been. And on New Horizon, the soldiers quietly stepped back from the residential sector, not because they were dismissed, but because their presence was no longer needed. And Lena Calder went back to watching the storm under the dome, unaware that her name had become a boundary the galaxy would never forget. And yet, even as the immediate crisis ended, the consequences did not recede, because the Council's retreat exposed something far more destabilizing than the loss of authority. It revealed that power in the galaxy had never truly rested in fleets or ancient law, but in cooperation freely given. And humanity, by withdrawing it without violence, had demonstrated a form of strength that no military doctrine accounted for. And within days the ripple effects became impossible to contain, as systems previously bound by council mandate began renegotiating their participation, rewriting charters, demanding moral review boards for enforcement actions. And when council hardliners attempted to frame the outcome as an unfortunate but contained exception, they found their words hollow in a galaxy that had watched an empire blink. And humanity, for its part, did not press the advantage, did not demand reform or punishment or restitution, but resumed trade gradually, selectively, prioritizing humanitarian corridors and essential infrastructure, a choice that baffled strategists who expected leverage to be exploited. Because humans were not interested in ruling the galaxy, only in drawing a line they would not cross again. And in the weeks that followed, the rebuilding of the Iridian archive began, not as a replacement, but as a memorial, a new structure designed collaboratively with dozens of species, its knowledge open by default, its guardianship distributed so no single council could ever claim sole authority over it again. And humanity contributed more than materials and expertise, contributing something else entirely, a clause embedded at the foundation of the new archive, written in every known language and encoded in every data format. No knowledge shall be preserved at the cost of a child, a sentence simple enough to seem obvious, yet radical enough to redefine galactic ethics. And it was adopted not because humans demanded it, but because no one could argue against it without sounding monstrous. And over time, the story of the crisis changed, as stories always do, stripped of legal nuance and procedural complexity, until what remained was a myth in the making, retold in academies and markets and family dwellings across the stars, of a species that had been asked for one child and had answered with everything it had instead. And for humanity, the aftermath was quieter, heavier,
because the cost of the standoff had not been measured only in disrupted trade or political tension, but in the realization of how close the galaxy had come to forcing them into a choice that would have broken something essential. And so they marked the day not as a holiday, but as a vow, an informal observance known simply as the line, when no banners were flown and no speeches made, but parents told their children stories of why the stars were not allowed to decide who was expendable, and soldiers remembered the moment they had stood ready not to conquer, but to shield, and diplomats rewrote training manuals to include a principle that could not be negotiated away. And years later, when a distant council successor faced a similar dilemma involving another species young, the precedent held without debate, because everyone remembered what happened the last time a child had been placed on the scales of law. And even Supreme Arbiter Vell, near the end of his long existence, requested a private audience with Ambassador Ellison, not to argue or accuse, but to ask a question that had troubled him since the vote, asking how a species so divided internally could act with such unity. And she answered simply that humanity argued endlessly about everything except one thing, because disagreement was a luxury reserved for times of safety, and when a child was threatened, the argument ended. And that answer spread farther than any treaty, because it revealed something fundamental about the species that terrified and inspired the galaxy in equal measure, that humans were not defined by their technology or adaptability, or even their resilience, but by an unspoken covenant that ran beneath all others, that the future was not a resource to be traded, but a responsibility to be defended. And in the long view of history, when scholars traced the slow shift from rule by ancient decree to rule by shared ethics, they marked that moment as a hinge point, not the day the council retreated, but the day the galaxy learned that humanity's greatest weapon was not its fleets or silence or strategic brilliance, but its refusal to accept a universe where innocence was negotiable. And so when humans later walked into council chambers or frontier negotiations or first contact encounters, other species listened differently, not because humans were feared, but because they were understood, because everyone knew that behind every human delegation stood something immovable, something that would not bargain or bend, and that knowledge reshaped diplomacy itself, because lines once blurred by precedent were now sharply defined. And in the end, the galaxy did not remember the exact wording of the ruling, or the legal codes invoked, or even the name of the archive that had been lost, but it remembered this, passed down in countless variations until it became a truth so widely accepted it no longer needed defending. That the stars learned a lesson the day they asked humanity for a child, and the lesson was simple and final. Humans will give you worlds, knowledge, labor, even their own lives if they must, but they will never, under any law written by any power in any age, surrender their children. And the universe, wiser for it, learned where humanity's red line was drawn and understood at last that it was not drawn in space or law or blood, but around the smallest hands reaching toward the future.